In this module, we're going to continue our discussion of monopsony and take a look specifically at labor's profit with respect to monopsony, mobility costs, but we'll also take a brief look again at the concept of wage makers versus wage setters. So let's start with that. When we think about monopsony, we recognize that we're dealing with firms that have some ability to pay workers less than they receive from the workers' marginal revenue product of labor. We don't consider them to be wage setters because they don't specifically set the wage. What they do is recognize that there is some amount of labor that they set. In this case, we said it was 20, based upon the confluence of our marginal expensive labor and our marginal revenue product of labor. And again, we're a little bit off of that, but based on the table values that we looked at, this relationship was as close as we could get, with MRP of L at 13.4 and marginal expensive labor at 11. Remember that we chose to rest at labor at 20 rather than going to the next highest value, which would have taken us to the opposite position where our marginal revenue product of labor would have been less than our marginal expensive labor. It's easy enough to lose money in business without designing it or without planning for it. And so in this case, we're choosing to default by having a small marginal profit of 2.4 per labor unit here. You never want to plan to lose money. You only want to plan to make money. And even when you plan to make money, every once in a while you're going to lose some money. So in this case, we've chosen to default so that marginal revenue product of labor greater than marginal expensive labor, even though our optimal generalized condition is an equality of those. Were this a competitive market, we would have had marginal revenue product of labor equaling the wage. And we would have seen in that case that we would have our worker surplus and employer surplus, as we normally expect to find them, such that worker surplus is in this area, employer surplus would be in the area above W star and below the demand curve. There would be no deadweight loss, and workers and employers make up the entirety of the market. And so all of this area would be considered some kind of total surplus or societal surplus, societal value. But in this case, we know that that's not going to be our reality. We know that we have some other problems brewing here. We know that we've got some mismatch in the market, such that we're going to be limiting our labor at 20. So we'll reform our worker surplus and employer surplus. Let's take a look at the employer surplus first. Employer surplus will now be the entirety of this area above the price that we're paying the workers, above their wage, which in this case we know is 8, because that is the dollar value of the wage we get when we interact the labor of 20 against the labor supply relation. And we can think of all of that area as employer surplus. But part of it is even a little richer to us than employer surplus. So I'm going to bifurcate this area. And I'll call the entirety of this area employer surplus. But this segment here is the profit that the employer is receiving. So profit from labor's activity. And while you might think of surplus as being profit generally, this is our marginal profit. In this case, we see that we're able to pay these workers 8. They're earning for us 13.4, and we have 20 of them. So 13.4 minus 8 times 20 becomes the profit that this firm will receive expressly from labor's output, where that output gives them a value greater than the cost. But remember again that the entirety of this area is the employer surplus. If we now think about worker surplus has been reduced, of course, into this area. And together, the employer surplus plus worker surplus is now the sum of our overall total surplus or societal value, which, as we can see, because there's a little space we've left off here to the side, that's not surplus of any kind, we recognize this area as deadweight loss. We can see that this marketplace, this society, loses some overall value. So the monopsony may create some express profit for the firm that they don't expressly see in a competitive market, but it reduces worker surplus sufficiently that the total benefit to society is less than it was, and it's less by this element or this measure of deadweight loss. Well, when we're looking at this, we really have to think about where does mobility cost come into this. So when we think about mobility cost, let's assume that you are the worker earning 8, but you know that you are, when I say earning 8, you're being paid 8, but you know that you're actually earning 13.4 for the firm you're working for. So there is some factor of marginal revenue product of labor minus the worker's wage and mobility, and in this case that value is 5.4. We know that this is a marketplace in which the firm has a monopsony a character, monopsony quality over the workers, and so they're being able to pay them less than they might have to in some other marketplace. Well, if we thought that we could get our marginal revenue product of labor as a wage elsewhere, so if MRP of L was equal to the wage elsewhere, and MRP of L was 13.4, we would suppose our wage could be 13.4. In which case, we might be willing to spend as much as 5.4 in order to go from this wage of 8 to the wage of 13.4. That difference, that spread, that 5.4, and this might be $5.4 per hour, might be $540 per month. It depends on what we're actually looking at. But if we could use that as a mobility cost extrapolated by the number of units that each worker would experience, we know that if the workers could get that additional amount, they would go for it, as long as the cost of mobility was less. So if the mobility cost is less than 5.4, then the worker will capture the difference between 5.4 and the cost of mobility. If it cost them 3 to make the move, they would still end up with a net value of 5.4. So the cost of mobility is an important element here. When it costs a worker to leave, and we know that it costs workers to move from any location to any other, even if it's a relatively short move, then we know that if that cost exists, then there is some monopsony power over the worker. So let's think about what those mobility costs might include. Maybe they're inclusive expressly of a cost of relocation, hiring the movers, going from point A to point B, entering a new marketplace and having to find a new employer. So there's some express costs that we can think about. But there's also some costs that aren't all that express. Maybe if I go to that new market, I leave my social networks behind. Maybe as I go to that new market, I don't have some of the recreation opportunities that I have where I am right now. If we leave, say, the Intermountain West, where we have the mountains and mild summers and the great snow, and we go to like Georgia, we're now going to have to suffer some humidity. We're not going to have the mountains. We're not going to have the snow. We're not going to have a mild summer. We will have a mild winter instead. So there's going to be some of what we refer to as psychic costs that might be associated with leaving social networks, that might be associated with leaving recreational opportunities or leaving family. And these would all be thought of with respect to utility. Sometimes very difficult to put a dollar value on those, but we have to try to do so in this whole scenario of identifying the cost of mobility. And if it actually costs us less to become mobile, to go from one worker or market environment to another, if that cost is less than the spread between marginal revenue product of labor and the wage being paid in the monopsony market, then the worker will go ahead and make that choice and experience the cost and pick up the net benefit as they do so.